So the first loop we're going to learn is the for loop. The general rule of thumb for when you should use a for loop is when you know the amount of repetition you need to do. When you know the amount of repetition, you would use the for loop. Why do I say a rule of thumb is, well, you could utilize a for loop without the repetition, without knowing how many times it's going to repeat itself, how many times it's going to do the for loop. Well, the problem is if you don't respect this rule of thumb, you're confusing people. Again, at the base, underneath it all, it's always going to be the same to the machine. These for loops, while loops, etc. is done so that it's easier on our eyes for us to read and understand the code. So the rule of thumb, when you know the amount of repetition, that's the moment you're going to use a for loop. So the for loop goes in a couple states. The for loop goes in a couple of states that we need to note. The first state is the initialization. So where we initialize all our variables in anything that we need to utilize inside of our loop. So any variables that would affect this loop's continuation or stop. Mind you, inside this initialize, you could add things that are not related to the condition, but again, you're going against the norm. So inside the initialize, you kind of want any variables that would affect the condition. So that's the first one. The second one is the second step of a for loop is the condition. What would make this body, this repetition continue? Why would it keep doing what it does? The condition will determine if it does the body or if it would exit. The condition is the number, it's the second step, and it's the step that you see over here. While the initialize, you normally could see it right here, right? The next step after the condition is to do the body inside. So if the condition is true, we're going to do what's inside the body of our for loop. So this is the step number 3, the body. So the body could contain many statements or one statement or nothing at all for whatever reason you want that. Okay, so we're going to do initialize, condition, do the body, and then the next step is we're going to increment any variable that will determine our condition or not. So these variables is step 4, which we would say increment or decrement, go in one direction, or remember, again, we're knowing the repetition, right? So let's say I have a variable x and I want x to be done. Let's say rather than that, I have students and I have in total 40 students. So I want students to start at 0. Inside my condition, I'm going to check is students, I'm still within my 40 amount of students, right? If I am, I'm going to do the body, take his exam, correct it. And when I'm done with that exam, I'm going to the next student. So this will get incremented to 1. That's step 4. Then I will check the condition. Am I still within my limit of amount of students I have? If it's true, well, then I would go back to the body. I would take the exam. I would correct it. Then I would increment. Then I would check again the condition. Okay? So something we'll notice, let me just close off this little thing here. So one thing we'll notice is the steps eventually will become into this triangle method. So after the condition is the body, then we go increment, then from increment is condition again, then from condition to body, increment, condition, body, increment, condition, body, increment, condition, body, until the condition is false. So notice that the initialize only happens once, while everything else will keep on happening multiple times. So let's try that inside code. So here's my for loop, and we're going to discuss it in a second, but just notice a couple things that's going on. We have a before the loop, so things could happen before the loop happens. When my loop happens, the part that's repeated is the body that's within these curly braces, right? So basically at this moment, there's only two things that are happening, right? So anything within this and this curly brace is the body. And when my loop is finished, at that moment, we are outside of the loop. So the normal processing of the application continues until we reach the end of our application. So if we were to compare this to this flowchart, well, this part, it would be somewhere before. This part, the for loop, is kind of a mixture of all of this, right? We're going to talk about it. And the last part over here, this would be this part here. Okay, it's a bit too much in our screen. You could pause it, figure things out. But for now, let's figure out what's going on. So before we get started and going in details, let's run it to see what's going on. When I run the application, you'll notice that we get before the loop. That's this line number 5. Actually, let's go ahead and write those line numbers. So this is line number 5. Then we'll notice we get a few times body with a number. So if we look over here, we got body plus X. That's our variable. Our variable started at 0 and it finished when it was higher, or when this condition was false. We're going to talk about it in details. So this part is the body of our loop, which is line number 8. There's only one line in there. It could have been more. And when our loop is finished, we're here, which is line 11. Okay, pretty straightforward. Let's go ahead and talk about what's going on inside of our loop. So the way the code works is, again, still one line at a time, one statement at a time. When it reaches line number 7, it will first do the initialize. Right? We talked about this. It will first do this initialize. This is number 1. Then it will check the condition. So number 2 is condition. This is important because if the condition is false to begin with, well, it will not do the next step, which is the body. We're gonna show you an example of that in a second. So the next step would be to do the body, whatever's inside the body. After the body is done, we will go ahead and do, where's my thing? After the body is done, we're going to do the increment, which is this part. Increment, decrement, just modifying the variables that's related to our condition. Okay, so that would be step number 4. After number 4, it will go back to the condition, check if it's true, then to the body, then to the increment. Condition, body, increment, condition, body, increment. Remember, it's this little triangle, I would say. So from the condition, it would go to the body. From the body, it would go to increment. And from the increment, obviously, it will go to the condition again. Right? So let's see how that would work. This is important to understand because you'll see variation of this for loop. And sometimes they don't respect the condition, body, increment ways of doing it. And we'll go with that as well. So let's go ahead and erase a little bit. So let's try and do this with our hands. So the first part is to initialize. Inside the initialize, right? Inside the initialize over here, we say x equals 0. So the value of x is 0. Then we get to our condition. Our condition must be true for us to do the body. So is x smaller than 5? That is true. X is 0. So this is true. So then we would do the body, which is to print line number, this line. Body plus x, the value is currently 0, so it would print out that. So over here, we could write print, and we could say, I'm just going to write B for body, right, colon 0, because the x value. Then we need to increment. We're at this level. X plus plus. So x, whatever the value is, add 1. And then we say the condition is 1 less than 5. That's true. Do the printing. B colon 1 because x is 1. Then we do the increment. 1 becomes 2. Is 2 less than 5? True. Print it out from the body, whatever the body is. It could be millions of lines in the body. Then increment, we're at 3. Is 3 less than 5? True. Print out 3. Increment is 4 less than 5? True. Print out 4. Then increment. Now this is where it gets interesting. Is 5 less than 5? No. 5 is equal to 5, not less than. So this is false. Notice that x is currently at 5, but the condition becomes false. So we don't do the body. So there's nothing happening here. So that's why you could see it here. It stops at body 4. The moment the condition is false, we'll continue outside of our loop, outside the body of our loop. In that case, it would be line 11 that would be running, right? Outside for loop. So this is a for loop. We know the amount of times we're repeating because we know when the value starts at 0 and when the value will stop based on this condition. This condition could be more complex. You could use ends and all that, everything that we've learned so far. The initialization, we could also make it more complex. So let's try that. Let's make it a bit more complex. So oops, let me go ahead and erase a little bit. And let's erase this. So we could have more conditions by doing comma. And we could have, let's say, int y equals 7. I might be a bit wrong in my syntax. Yes, I am. Maybe I don't need. There we go. So I initialize x and I initialize y. Sorry for being wrong in my syntax. Happens a lot. Don't memorize code. Now I have 2 variables. It's up to me if I utilize those 2 variables or not. I could, again, still run it. It will work out fine. However, I could also do an n where I say, well, y has to be bigger than 0 as another condition. While these 2 are true, well, it will run. And again, my application could still continue forward, if you notice now. Still doing the same thing because the y is not really changing values. Over here in the body, I could obviously add the y. So let's say y equals plus y. And now we could see the value of y throughout each repetition, which is always 7. And inside the increment, again, the same way I could add to every different part, to the initialization, to the condition. We could also add it to my increment or decrement. So, comma, and we could here make it a bit more complex. Y equals y minus, let's say, 3, as an example. Right? If I press run, you'll notice that my loop now has ended a bit earlier than previously. Previously reached 4 for the x, but this time y negates that because after 2 times it's already less than 0, right? So as soon as this becomes false, well, then it's going to stop. Now, the same thing I could add into these parts of my for loop. I could also remove those parts. So if I wanted to, I could make the initialization empty and I could add it outside. Notice that I still need to have my semicolon there. But now initialization is done outside the for loop. If that makes it cleaner for you to read, well, then go for it. Otherwise, try not to create variables outside which are only necessary for my loop. You want to contain them together as a clean code. If we run it, we should still see the same thing. We could also put the condition inside, but it's something we haven't learned yet. So for now, we're going to avoid it. And for the increments, the same way we could have it here, we could also have it at the end of our body loop. Because remember, the increment happens after body, so we could always come here and say x plus plus, and let's put a semicolon here, and y equals y minus 3. So we're doing our increments after the real body. And you'll notice, again, I still need that semicolon to separate the condition with the increment. Mind you, now they're just empty. Will it run? Well, yeah, it'll do the same thing. Mind you, doing this outside of my body could cause issues. Notice how it's saying 0, 1, 2, 3, 7, 4, 1. If I made the mistake of putting my increments before my output, you'll notice that my output to the screen is not going to be 0, 1, 2 or 7, 4, 1. It's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, minus 2. Right? So the order of processing matters, and where you put this could cause issues. Maybe not with you because you just wrote the code, but the you in 5 years, or the next guy beside you who barely knows how to code. Either or. Right? So we want to, again, work as a team. So we don't want to do any fancy things. We don't want to do magic tricks. We want to make this straightforward so that no mistakes would happen. Human mistakes is the biggest mistake. Now, before we go forward, there's one last thing we want to point out. Let's bring this back to a normal for loop code. The last mistake is what would happen if my condition is never false. And those cases happen. It could cause problems on our server. I know for a fact when I was a student, I stopped my server because it was in an infinite loop. This infinite loop means basically our variables are going to the other direction. Our variables are going to the other direction of our condition's end. Let's make this a bit simpler so we could kind of see it. We're just going to utilize x again. And what do I mean by this? Let's go ahead and erase all of that. Let's run it. So notice right now, our x, let me draw this out. Our x starts at 0. So somewhere on this line, okay, of infinitely numbers, our x starts here at 0. That's our initialization. Over here is where we initialize. Our condition says while x is less than 5. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is our end. The moment it reaches here, it has to finish this loop. It cannot continue. So this is pretty easy because we notice, let me show you this with a different color. We notice this because our increment is increasing. So after each loop, we're becoming 1, we're becoming 2, we're becoming 3, we're becoming 4, and lastly we'll become 5. This is the moment we end our application. What would happen if I wasn't going towards positive, but I was going towards negative, right? What would happen then? Let's say over here, rather than increasing, I decrease. So I press run, and you'll notice, again, the computer runs really fast. This is actually becoming really slow because it has to output it to the screen. Notice that this is not stopping because we're not going towards our end. We're actually going towards the other way. And the other way is going further and further away from our end. And what happens in this case is we cause something called a infinite loop. It's a loop where it's not going to finish. So this could become problematic, especially if we do it on, if we publish our code on a server as an example, and that server is hosting a lot of things. Well, then it's stuck in this infinite loop, meaning it cannot ever reach the remainder of the code, meaning that other applications are frozen because of this. As Let's say we dumb it down. Okay, so this is a big problem that could happen. You need to pay attention that this kind of stuff doesn't happen. Cool. Thanks guys. I'll see you guys in the next video. While loops.